Pakistan is in crisis. The economy is on the verge of collapse, an energy crisis has overtaken the country, and foreign reserves have plummeted dangerously, all while the country fights to recover from last year's catastrophic floods. Pakistan estimates that it will need roughly $16.5 billion to recover from the floods, which killed over 17,000 people and affected 33 million others. Months after massive floods disseminated farms and villages in Pakistan, countries around the world have pledged more than $9 billion to assist Pakistan in recovering and rebuilding from the terrible summer floods, which the UN chief described as a climate disaster of monumental scale. So what are the details behind this aid, and who is involved in it? Pakistan experienced its heaviest rainfall on record last year. By early January 2023, up to 4 million children were still living in contaminated and stagnant floodwaters, putting their lives and well-being in danger. Children are frail and hungry as they fight severe acute malnutrition, diarrhea, malaria, dengue fever, typhoid, acute respiratory infections, and painful skin problems. Aside from physical health issues, the longer the crisis lasts, the higher the risk to children's mental health. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of homes have been demolished or damaged, as have several public health facilities, water systems, and schools. Echoing the same worries, Pakistan's permanent representative to the United Nations in Geneva, Khalil Hashmi, stated that 8 million of the 33 million people affected by the catastrophe remain acutely displaced, since flood levels in some areas have yet to drain. According to Ambassador Hashmi, housing, agriculture, and livelihoods are among the most pressing needs today. That's the immediate side of it, and that's the human side of it, he insisted ahead of the high-level Pakistan meeting in the Swiss city, which Pakistan Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres attended. The conference's specific goal was to bring together leaders from the public and private sectors in order to generate financial and international support for communities affected by last year's devastating floods in Pakistan, as well as to rehabilitate and rebuild damaged infrastructure in a climate-resilient manner. According to the UN and Pakistani officials, the flooding killed over 17,000 people, wrecked over 2 million houses, and submerged as much as one-third of the country at a time, causing damage reaching more than $30 billion. According to the United Nations, large sections of the country are still underwater, with millions of people living near toxic or stagnant waters. Pakistani Deputy Foreign Minister Hina Rabini Kar stated at the end of a day-long discussion at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva that the final count exceeded a target for the international community to meet half of the estimated $16.3 billion needed to respond to the flooding. The remainder is likely to come from the Pakistani government. Taken together, these commitments total more than $9 billion, and from what we know so far, these are all additional commitments from what has already been given in terms of humanitarian assistance, etc., from both bilateral and multilateral partners, she said, adding that several delegations had also offered in-kind support. UN pledging conferences often draw promises of big sums from governments, international organizations, and other donors, but those don't always get fulfilled entirely. The Pakistani government has announced plans for independent, outside monitors to make sure that the funds go where they are needed. The conference was framed as a test of how much wealthier nations will contribute to assisting developing world countries like Pakistan in dealing with the effects of climatic swoons and preparing for other disasters. According to Achim Steiner, the head of the United Nations Development Program, which assisted in organizing the conference, Pakistan's government understands that contributors will be looking for outcomes such as accountability, clarity, efficiency, transparency, and effectiveness of the programs that will be funded. There is no free money, and everybody who pledged their contributions today will come with certain expectations, Steiner said in an interview. While the demands are pressing now, he believes that Pakistan's recovery and resilience programs should be designed to persist in an era marked and endangered by climate change. I think the hardest part, in a sense, is yet to come because the urgency, the desperations are acute. he said, adding that governments and international institutions will face a challenge. How do we quickly deliver in an unbureaucratic fashion, but not by simply doling out money? These are investments that should last for a generation. They need to be well planned. Earlier, Pakistani Information Minister Mariam Aurangzeb tweeted that top donors were the Islamic Development Bank, which contributed $4.2 billion, the World Bank, which contributed $2 billion, and the Asian Development Bank, which contributed $1.5 billion. She stated that the European Union had pledged $93 million, Germany had pledged $88 million, China had offered $100 million, and Japan had pledged $77 million. The U.S. announced an additional $100 million to Pakistan on top of a similar amount already committed. Saudi Arabia's envoy laid out a pledge of $1 billion. According to Steiner, the large promises from international financial institutions demonstrate that pressure and expectations are growing almost daily for them to do more to address the challenges of climate change, decarbonization, and energy transitions. In-person attendees included Pakistani Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif and United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, while other world leaders such as French President Emmanuel Macron and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan participated virtually. Today's meeting is an attempt to give my people another choice at getting back on their feet, Sharif said. We are racing against time to help the victims amid a harsh winter and in the worst affected areas where schools and health systems have collapsed, he added. People in South Asia are 15 times more likely to die as a result of climate change, according to Gutierrez, and his heart broke when he observed firsthand the devastation caused by Pakistan's floods, which he described as a prime example of the impact of climate change. Countries agreed to establish a fund for loss and damage caused by climate change at the United Nations climate negotiations in November. This year, a group will hash out the details. The fund is meant to compensate vulnerable countries such as Pakistan. Many scientists, policymakers, and others believe that emissions of heat-trapping gases, primarily by industrialized countries, are largely to blame for global warming. Many countries have already helped Pakistan in the early aftermath of the disaster. The summit, attended by 44 countries and a dozen international financial institutions, aimed to complement and build on prior outlays. Thousands of Pakistanis are still living in open areas near stagnant water in southern Sindh and some parts of southwestern Balochistan, the two worst affected provinces. According to Julian Harnese, the United Nations resident coordinator in Pakistan, an estimated 5 million people live near the stagnant waters, making it difficult for them to live a regular life. He projected that little would change until March. According to the United Nations, financing for flood victims in Pakistan may run out this month, and an emergency appeal started in October has raised only about a third of the $816 million needed. According to UNICEF, only 37% of a $173.5 million target for assisting flood-affected Pakistani women and children has been met. Pakistani has a minuscule impact on global warming and emits less than 1% of heat-trapping carbon dioxide, but experts believe it, like other developing countries, is vulnerable to climate-induced destruction. In recent years, the country has experienced high heat, glacial melt, and increasing sea levels. According to the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project website, reports have surfaced that less than a fourth of the $160 million previously given by the United States for flood relief efforts has reached communities on the ground. According to local estimates, the Pakistani public has received only $38.35 billion in help, with the remaining unaccounted for, fraud and corruption suspected. The website quoted Price as saying, "This is something we take very seriously, not only in Pakistan but anywhere around the world where American taxpayer dollars are implicated and when there is an urgent humanitarian interest at stake. Such concerns are understandable given Pakistan's history with AIDS." Oxfam said in 2011 that an independent financial investigation had revealed fraud in a flood assistance operation in Sindh. PricewaterhouseCoopers discovered that cash was diverted for operating expenses, overheads, and human resources for 2 humanitarian initiatives involving water supply and sanitation supplies to flood-affected people. After invoices were faked and checks to suppliers were twisted, the inquiry showed a loss of up to $220,000. According to a 2007 report published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., the $1 billion sent to Pakistan after 9/11 saved lives in affected areas by the 2005 earthquake and helped a smaller number of people, but has done little to address the underlying fault lines in the Pakistani state or society. The World Bank and the Asian Development Bank have also been ineffective, according to the report. The Cato Institute proposed several solutions to Pakistan's problems on its website. What the Pakistani people need is not more misnamed foreign aid, funneled through corrupt and inefficient bureaucracies, but jobs. Trade, not aid, will help create real productive work, rather than political patronage positions, the website stated. It stated that Islamabad needs to literalize its own economy as countries like Pakistan make entrepreneurship, business development, and job creation well nigh impossible. It stated that over a half a century of experience with foreign aid demonstrated that money from overseas just serves to disguise the consequences of underdevelopment. More often, such transfers actually hinder development by strengthening the very governments and policies which stand in the way of economic growth, it added.